Okay, today we are going to learn how to solve quadratics using something called the quadratic formula. So far we've learned how to solve quadratics using factoring and using square roots. And both of those methods work for some quadratics, but they don't work for others. The cool thing about solving with the quadratic formula is that you can solve any quadratic using the quadratic formula. Okay, so let's just look at why we would even care about having this. There are some quadratics like x squared plus 5x plus 2 equals 0 that you can't factor. There's no way to factor that. It's hard to use the square root. You would have to do something called complete the square, which you haven't talked about. And so it just gets complicated. So we have this nice thing that we can use in this kind of situation called the quadratic formula. Okay, and the quadratic formula is going to look kind of crazy, but I want you guys to know that it does come from somewhere important. It comes from a process called completing the square. So that's where we derive this. I'm not going to go through the way we derive the quadratic formula, but just know that there is a reason why it exists, and it's not just some random thing that someone invented. So this formula works for any quadratic in a general form. So you can just think of any quadratic as ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. A, b, and c can be any number, except for a cannot be 0. Okay, so if that's your quadratic, then the quadratic formula says that your solutions, your x values, are going to be this lovely fraction right here. Okay, so we're going to go through and talk about how we would use this quadratic formula. And you're going to get so used to using it that you're probably going to eventually have it memorized. So here's your steps for solving the quadratic formula. The first step is to set the quadratic equal to 0. Next is identify a, b, and c. So make a little note here that this may require multiplying or simplifying. So you might have to combine some like terms or multiply things together because you have to have it in standard form so that you can find your a, b, and c. After you've identified a, b, and c, then you're just going to plug those values into your quadratic formula that we have circled above. And then you're going to simplify very carefully. Most people make mistakes with the quadratic formula when it comes down to simplifying. Okay, so if you look at the formula, you have a square root you have to simplify. You have some things you have to add and subtract together. You have a fraction you have to simplify. So you have to take this step by step. Okay? So let's go ahead and do a couple examples of this. So I'm going to zoom out so that we can see both the problem and the formula for this one. So if I'm doing x squared plus 4x plus 7 equals 0, my first step is to set it equal to 0. Check. Then I'm going to identify a, b, and c. Luckily, this quadratic is in standard form already, so it'll be easy to identify a, b, and c. The a is the number in front of your x squared, which is just a 1. The b is the number in front of your x, which is a 4. And the c is that last number at the end that doesn't have any x's with it. So we know a, b, and c. Now we're just going to plug those values back into the quadratic formula that we have up here. Okay, so we're going to have x equals negative b, so in this case negative 4, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 4 squared, minus 4 times my a value, which is 1, times my c value, which is 7. And all of that's divided by 2 times my a value, which is 1. Okay. You might want to press pause here and just make sure you understand how I plugged in those numbers to the formula to get this new fraction. So our next step, now that I have it plugged in, is to simplify very carefully. So I'm just going to go through and start combining some like terms and multiplying. So I have negative 4 plus or minus 4 squared is 16. Then I'm going to do 4 times 1 times 7. So 4 times 1 is 4. And then 4 times 7 is 28. All of that's over 2 times 1 is just 2. Okay. Then I'll do a little bit more simplifying. So I have 4 plus or minus the square root 16 minus 28 is going to be a negative 12 over 2. So now I have kind of the easy step simplified. My next step is going to be to simplify that square root of negative 12. So I always like to do the square root kind of on the side. So I'm going to come over here and find what the square root of negative 12 is. So first, since I have the square root of a negative number, it's the same thing as I square roots of 12. Then I'll break down 12 to 4 and 3, 2 and 2. I have a pair of 2's, the leftover 3, which means I can rewrite this as 2I square roots of 3. And I'm just going to come over and I'm going to replace the square root of 12 with that 2I square roots of 3. Okay, so x equals negative 4 plus or minus 2I square roots of 3 over 2. Okay, and at this point, once you've simplified your square root, this is where you're going to want to separate this equation into two different equations. So remember, I have this plus minus symbol, which means that I need to have one version of this fraction where I'm adding and one version where I'm subtracting. So I'm going to have one that's x equals negative 4 plus 2I over 3 divided by 2, and then another answer that's x equals negative 4 minus 2I square roots of 3 over 2. And then my last thing I can do is if the number on the bottom, so in this case the 2, if I can divide that into both of the numbers on the top, so the 4 and the 2, then I can simplify the fraction. So it would be like negative 4 divided by negative 2, which is negative 2, and 2 divided by 2, which is just 1. So it's going to be negative 2 plus I square roots of 3. That's one of my answers. And over here I can do the same thing. So I can divide the 4 and the 2 on the top by the 2 on the bottom to get negative 2 minus I square roots of 3. Okay, and those are going to be my two answers for that problem. Okay, so using the quadratic formula is a way that you're definitely going to get the right answer. It is somewhat lengthy, so if you can factor, I would recommend factoring instead of doing this. And you also want to be careful with all your simplifying steps. There's lots of places to make mistakes. Okay, let's go ahead and do another one. I'm going to do this one in black just so that I don't get it confused with the one we just barely did. So this quadratic is already set equal to 0 and it's already in standard form. So I'm just going to identify the a, b, and c. So 3, 16, and 5. Then I'm going to plug it into that formula that we have up here. Get it back out again as we plug it in. So x equals negative b, so negative 16, plus or minus b squared, so 16 squared, minus 4 times a times c. All of that is over 2 times your a value. Okay. Now if you look at this, these numbers are starting to get big, so you might want to pull out a calculator. I'm going to, because I don't know what 16 squared is off the top of my head. And we're going to start simplifying this. So I have x equals negative 16 plus or minus the square root. 16 squared is 256 minus 4 times 3 times 5. So 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 5 is 60. All of that divided by 6. Okay. Now I'm going to simplify that stuff that's inside the square root. So 256 minus 60 is going to be the square root of 196 all over 6. Now this one you may or may not know, but the square root of 196 is actually just equal to 14. So in this case, I'm going to be able to get rid of my square root completely by just replacing the square root of 196 with 14. Okay, so once I've got the square root simplified, that's when I'm going to separate it into two different problems. So I have x equals negative 16 plus 14 over 5, and x equals negative 16 minus 14 over 5. So negative 16 plus 14 is going to be a negative 2 over 5. Can't simplify that fraction any further, so that's one of my answers. Negative 16 minus 14 is a negative 30 over 5. That fraction I can simplify because negative 30 divided by 5 is just 6. So my two answers for that are negative 2/5 and 6. Okay. This example we just did is actually one that you could have done with factoring, but sometimes it's nice to use the quadratic formula if you prefer that. Okay. Let's do one more example. I want to do this one down here, E. Actually, let's do F. Okay. F looks different because we don't have a C value. So let's go ahead and see what that would look like. So I have A is 6, B is -2, and C is 0. So it is possible for one of you, for either your B or your C to be 0. Like if you look back at the example E, since there's no values that just have an R, the B would be 0. Okay, so just know that is an option. Then I'm going to go ahead and plug these values into my quadratic formula. X equals negative B. This is important that you've got a negative, like the quadratic formula says that you've got to make B negative. So if your B is already negative, you've got to use parentheses. Plus or minus the square root, and again, here we have to do B squared, so make sure you put your B in parentheses, negative B squared, minus 4 times A times C, all over 2 times A, so 2 times 6. Okay, let's do some simplifying. So the -2, that first term is going to cancel out to just be a 2, plus or minus the square root, and here I have -2 squared, so lots of people want to say that's -4. It's not. -2 times -2 is a +4, and then I would have -4 times 6 times 0. But anything times 0 is going to be 0, so that term is just going to go away, and all of that is over 12. Okay. Square root of 4, that's an easy one. We know that one off the top of our heads. That's just 2. So I'm going to separate this into two problems. I have x equals 2 plus 2 over 12, and x equals 2 minus 2 over 12. Okay. We'll simplify this first one first. So 2 plus 2 is 4 over 12, so the fraction 4/12. I can simplify this fraction by dividing the top and the bottom by the same number. In this case, I'll choose 4, and I'll get 1 over 3. So 1/3 is one of my answers. 2 minus 2 is 0 over 12. 0 over 12, 0 over any number is just going to be 0. So 0 is my other answer there. Okay. So this is a good example of here with the C being 0, it kind of makes your life a little bit easier, right? That square root was able to simplify down a lot quicker. So a big takeaway with the quadratic formula is just make sure you're plugging all the numbers in to the formula correctly. Okay? Make sure you put like a big box or star by this formula. Then when you start simplifying the quadratic formula, you just have to be so careful. And just be careful that you're multiplying correctly, squaring correctly, that you're not changing any signs that you don't need to change.